Did you feel that your relationship with your babies was impacting your relationship with other people in your life, either positively or negatively? My guest today, Brandy, shares a story of an intensity with her babies that so many of us can relate to. Having these intense feelings of wanting to care for and protect her babies in such a way that she can, in hindsight, in looking back, articulate beautifully the impact that it had on her other relationships. And this is something that so many of us struggle with. We have this intense desire to keep our babies safe, to keep them with us, to keep them close. And she shares how her own personal history with trauma exacerbated these feelings. So if you have any history of trauma, we don't go very deeply into specifics, but it is mentioned. So if you have a history of trauma and even mentioning that could impact you, then please take care. And I hope that everyone enjoys this beautiful story with a beautiful person. I give you Brandy. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic, medical, and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
I'm Brandy Lefsick. I live in Athol. I have a yoga studio in Orange, Mass called Home and Heart Studio. It's at 30 Whitney Street. And I have 3 kids, boy, ages 16, almost 15. They'll be 15 in August, and 7.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to take you back to before you were a parent and have you think about your cultural upbringing and just tell me what your exposure to baby feeding and breastfeeding was before you were doing it yourself.
I don't think I really had a lot of exposure. I don't really remember. I think that I may have had some aunts that breastfed, but I don't know that to be a fact. I don't have any memory of them breastfeeding. I would say the first real time I saw it was my sister-in-law, who my nephew is 4 years older than my oldest son. So that was the first time I saw somebody really like embracing breastfeeding. And I was in awe of it. I knew that if I could breastfeed, that I wanted to.
Yeah. And when you say embracing breastfeeding, I think that's a really beautiful term, because some people breastfeed and they just kind of slog through it, which that's the way it goes for people. And nobody wants to slog through anything. And that's a true act of sacrifice for their children if somebody ends up slogging through breastfeeding. But by embracing breastfeeding, what do you mean? What did you see her doing that was embracing it?
Well, she wasn't covering it up to make people comfortable. I mean, to an extent, I remember going to a mall together and, you know, we did go in like a ladies' room and she breastfed. It just, she was still really relatively open around her own family, you know, around her own father, her brother, which is my husband. And so like, it just made it was natural. That's how you feed a baby. And it was beautiful, I thought.
Yeah. Did that change the way your own husband viewed breastfeeding, you think? Just being able to see his sister do it 4 years before you were?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, it wasn't really something we had ever discussed, but he knew that it was something that I wanted to do. I also didn't want to put any pressure on myself. So like if it didn't work, that was fine. But I wanted to try it. And so he was supportive. for sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, so you had this one amazing example, and sometimes that's all it takes is just that one person who shows the way for us, which I think is so cool. And I think that goes far beyond feeding babies. I mean, it could be for yoga, or it could be for any number of things that change our lives. Just having the one person be like, yeah, this is possible for you. Yeah. Is pretty cool. So then 4 years later, you are starting your family. So tell me what you were thinking about when it came to baby feeding as you were pregnant, and any kind of preparation you did.
For preparation, I would say, I mean, I read all like the books, the What to Expect When You're Expecting. Like, I mean, every single page, read it. And
wow,
there was another book at the time that was written by Jenny McCarthy. It was actually a good, funny read and easy read. And that was something I read. I don't remember any other books offhand, but I did the basic, classes that you go to. And they talk about breastfeeding. There's no other real preparation for breastfeeding for me, but except for, once you have the baby and try first latch, which didn't work actually, right away. I felt like I needed some help with the nurses and midwives. I was at Greenfield Hospital for my first one. It was a really nice, lovely experience with midwives there. And I definitely felt like, there's this little baby and my breasts were like 3 sizes times of his head, So like, how do you actually do this?
Oh, right.
But it happens. They just do it.
Yeah. So tell me about that. Tell me about any impact you think your birth experience might have had on that first latch, and then how supported or unsupported you felt at the hospital environment once you did have your baby, when it came to baby feeding in particular.
So my actual labor was, I feel like kind of long and hard. I ended up getting an epidural, but it only numbed one side of my body. And so I had like total sensation on one side and no sensation on the other. And so I was still really experiencing like some of the pain, and it was painful. And leading into it, that was also another thing for me. I wanted to try natural, but I also like knew myself well enough that if I reached a point where like I couldn't handle it, totally was okay with asking for help. And I did, but it was strange because it didn't quite like do everything it was supposed to. And yeah, the labor itself was long. The pushing was long. I was really exhausted. I was in labor for about 20 hours, and there was a lot of tearing. I had a lot of stitches. I lost a lot of blood. So by the end of it, I've really felt like, beat up, like a train hit you.
Yeah.
Labor is hard.
Yeah. And that's a hard way to start trying to learn a new skill that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of patience, as you're also worrying about the health of that little baby.
Yeah. So Sawyer, my first, so he, came out totally great and healthy. And we, did all the things. So like, you have the baby right away. I didn't want anybody to take the baby. Like, it needed to be me first. And a prolonged, before cutting the cord and all of that, we tried to do that. And I just remember like looking at him, and of course I already had all this love for this being, but also really feeling like this was a stranger. Now here's this person, but like, I don't really know them yet. They don't really know me yet, even though we'd had 9 months together, but in a totally different way. And it felt like this overwhelming love, like the Grinch, and your heart grows 3 times, right? It just like was instant, but there was still a lot of, I would say like maybe trepidation. Is that the right word? Where I felt still like, now what do I do?
Yeah.
And, they encourage you to try to latch right away. And I just remember sort of trying to hold his head, and his head was bobbling and I was shaking, and it was literally like this whole shaky moment. And then they do that kind of quick latch, and it was also painful, and I wasn't quite expecting that, but then it happened, and the nurse kind of came and helped me reposition how I was holding him, and to put us both in a more comfortable, not quite so awkward stance. And then that was it. I was on my breastfeeding way.
Wow. I love this description you give of, this baby, you've been spending 9 months with them, yet you still kind of feel like strangers. And I think one of the things that's missing in postpartum care is this encouragement of those of us who care for people in the postpartum period to spend the time just focusing on getting to know your baby. Because often what I find people doing is handing over their power to care providers and saying, what do you think? What does my baby need? Like, how should I change their diaper? Or how do I know if they're hungry? And what I try to do as frequently as possible is say, well, you tell me, like, you've been spending however much time with your baby. So if it's only been 3 hours, it's 3 hours more than what I've been spending with your baby. So what have you noticed already? Because you've already been on this trajectory of getting to know your baby. And the more time you spend getting to know your baby and just focusing on knowing that you're the one who's going to know as you build this relationship, the better it's going to be. And I have found that with my clients, often they're so worried about reporting to me or to the pediatrician how many pees and poops and how many bottles and how many times they've nursed that they're like tracking it in the apps. So that when I ask, well, what are the signs of hunger or how often they're feeding, they go straight to the phone instead of like thinking, well, let me think about my day and let me think about my child and what I've noticed about my child. And we've almost created this in the medical system, like, because we want to know that babies are peeing and pooping appropriately and that they're getting enough to keep them safe. But it also is this double-edged sword where then parents start to lose this ability to believe that they are the ones who can get to know their child. And so this description you give of like, you kind of feel like strangers, but then it's your job to like, get to know your baby. Like that's how you know if they're doing well is by getting to know them.
Yeah.
Like that, I feel like is like the piece that we all have to figure out. And sometimes it takes us a couple of days to figure it out. And sometimes like, I feel like I didn't settle into that until my son was like multiple years old, till my oldest was that, oh yeah, like there's so many things I missed because I was too busy trying to like fix patterns instead of just recognizing, oh, this is just how he is as an individual.
Yeah.
Because they do feel like strangers when they come.
Yeah.
Even though you do love them.
Yeah.
So do you think that breastfeeding is what created that intensity for you? Or do you think that intensity would have been there whether or not you had breastfed? Or do you think it contributed in some way?
It definitely contributed. I mean, I felt so connected to my kids by breastfeeding. It was just really like empowering to me. I felt, I'm the mom. Mm-hmm. I know this baby more than anyone else is ever going to know this baby. Mm-hmm. They were mine. Mm-hmm. And it felt very primal, possessive. It created like this, and I'm sure you can get that feeding your child and and I only with all of eventually I did some bottle feeding with Sawyer, but I primarily breastfed. I didn't pump and have other people feed. Like it was me. And as hard as it was, and it was hard at times, but also again, it was like, I don't regret any of that time, at all, ever.
Yeah. So you get home and you had a little pain in the hospital with your first, but did that resolve pretty quickly or did it go on for a while?
No, I mean, I think, I came home and I was definitely still tired, sore, all the things. You just had a baby. But the worst part was the sleeping. Like I remember it was probably a week after and we were going to visit in-laws and I just started crying and my husband's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, I'd never experienced that kind of tired fatigue before. Because it's like you go through birth and then you can't quite catch up to your full like recovery, because then especially if you are exclusively breastfeeding, and you're waking up every few hours, there's not a long stretch of sleep. I tried the first few nights of having Sawyer in his bedroom, which was not far, but it was down the hall, and like waking up, going down to sit, and it just eventually I brought him in our room in a bassinet. And then at one point fell asleep with him on my chest. And we fell asleep together and slept the longest stretch that either of us had slept since coming home. And then I was like, oh yeah, this is what we're going to do. I'm not going to do. So then I've co-slept with all my kids from that point.
Yeah.
And it was just easier. It was like survival for me.
Right. Yeah. And that's how humans evolved. And what makes that unsafe is our modern bedding, not anything about actually a human sleeping with a baby.
Right. Yeah. It made so much sense. Right. And I had, I also, again, my sister-in-law co-slept and breastfed. And that was something that, I know made it easier for her to be able to kind of roll over once you really get the hang of things. And once baby's big enough to be able to just sort of roll over and let them nurse. And so I knew that could happen. And I was very, very aware. I slept first for the longest time with him on my chest until he was big enough that then like he could roll and be between my husband and I, and I'd be in all kinds of weird positions with my arms to because you're aware, I think.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of studies that show the hormonal response between a breastfeeding mom and a baby that protects the baby and alerts the mom when there's any movement. And, there's all sorts of studies that show that. And then there's the anthropological and evolutionary studies that show that this is how humans have done it for all of human history. And I think this is one of the barriers that get in the way to breastfeeding is, we do want all babies to be safe. And when there's any sort of mixed feeding, that there's not the same hormonal response. We have to be careful there. But when families are getting so little sleep, because now when humans evolved in these huge social structures where you had lots of people helping you care for a baby, and now it's like one mom, one dad, or two people, or maybe even just one person caring for one baby or multiple children, it's way harder. And then you're trying to just get by on as little sleep as you can. And then you're being told by all healthcare providers, make sure the baby's sleeping in a separate surface on their back, which, babies don't like sleeping on their back. So then you're getting very little sleep. So, we've helped solve some problems, but we've created other problems by doing that. And so instead of healthcare providers being willing to have full conversations with people about, okay, so these are the risks. These are the benefits. What would be best for your family given your situation? But families then are afraid to say, hey, I would like to sleep with my baby because they're afraid they're going to get judged. And then instead they fall asleep on the couch or they fall asleep in the recliner, which is way less safe than co-sleeping. And then they are not getting as much sleep to begin with anyway, because they're getting up in the middle of the night and trying to stay awake. And it creates this cycle when all along they could get support to do the safest thing by sleeping with their babies. It's so challenging.
Yeah.
Okay. So you figured that out, the sleeping situation, and you talked about this intensity, and you talked about being the only person who could care for this baby. So what did that look like as far as breastfeeding and then your day to day? Were you able to leave and go? Were you already practicing yoga at that time?
Yeah, I was. So I probably took at least 8 weeks, maybe even 12 weeks before I went back to teaching. And, but I eventually did go back to teaching, but I would pretty much for the first at least 6 months, if not more, if I left Sawyer or, he would be with my mom, mother-in-law, like a sister-in-law, my husband. I was very, very limited. I was psychotic sort of. So I was very limited on who I allowed, it was mostly me and very little time with other people. But definitely as he got older, and then you need more time for yourself and more time to be apart. But I didn't want to be apart. Every so often, there's a time where I was definitely felt over touched because I would hold this baby like all day long because I wanted to, like wearing my baby, and just like, that was it. They were mine, and I worked and functioned and did everything. I held them all the time. And so I definitely felt like overtouched at the end of the night. Like I didn't have a lot of energy for anybody else except for the baby. But that was what I wanted and needed to be the kind of mother that I wanted to be. It was just like, that was it. That was what I wanted.
What's the age difference between the first and the second?
17 months.
17 months. Okay.
It would have been, so my second was born early at 30. My water broke at 33 weeks. And then went to the hospital. They kind of stopped everything. I don't remember even the name of the medication, but I was given medication to like stop contractions, and I was put on bed rests and IVs and fluids. And because they had measured, well, first of all, how big, and it was looking like this, my second was about 3 pounds at the time, and that they're able to tell, I forget what it's called, but how their lungs are functioning, and they want it to be at a certain level, and the level was really, really low. And so we were just trying to keep every day we could keep this baby in was going to mean another day that they could get bigger and their lungs could get stronger. But that also meant that up until that point, like I'd never really been away from Sawyer. And so he was only 17 months. He was still a baby. But my husband, and at that point I was at Bay State, Springfield, because it was a high risk and a preemie. So he would work, and then he'd pick up my son, and he'd drive to the hospital, and sometimes they would both sleep with me in the hospital at night, and then he'd bring him to my mom's or his mom's and do work and then come back. And because I wanted Sawyer to be with him as much as possible. It killed me that I had those like 11 days where I couldn't continue to be the mom to him before I had another one, but that's what happened.
Was he still breastfeeding at that time?
No. So he had stopped breastfeeding. I stopped breastfeeding him at 10 months. Mostly because like he was just a really, really big kid, and he was ready to like walk, talk, and eat solid food. And so he was done. He didn't want to cuddle and be held and contained anymore for it. So
yeah, what was that like for you?
I think by then I was like ready, and I got pregnant almost like as soon as we stopped. And then my second pregnancy was really challenging. I had a lot of health issues, so that was hard to be pregnant and to have a baby, and to have like pregnancy issues that just the normal fatigue, but I had extra issues on top of it.
Yeah.
There would be days where I would just like barricade a room in my house with a baby gate and just lay on the floor, and Sawyer could just rip the room apart and do what he needed to do.
Right.
I couldn't like really do much else.
There was no managing a toddler.
Yeah.
I have a really busy week coming up, and I thought, what better way to reduce my stress than to go onto feastandfettle.com and order meals for that week so I can just take one thing off of my plate by putting delicious meals onto my plate. See what I did there? So I went on to their website. It's really easy to use. I looked at all of the menu options for the week, and some of the things I'm excited about are some grilled steak tips with a delicious Thai peanut sauce and some green beans with a soy sesame sauce that's on the side. But there's so many other things. And that is one of the ways that I am choosing to provide self-care for myself so that I can reduce my stress load. If you would like to do the same and spend more time with your family and less time worrying about what's for dinner, go to feastandfettle.com to get home cooked meals delivered right to your front door. And you can get $30 off your first week's delivery by using my code MILK, MILK. And just let somebody else cook for you. You won't regret it.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you are more than aware of all the barriers that can make feeding our babies so difficult. You are also more than aware that support can make all the difference. So if you are struggling to feed your baby in the way that you had hoped, or if it is more stressful or anxiety inducing than you had anticipated, then what are you waiting for? I am here for you. Go to my website, www.quabbinbirthservices.com. I can't wait to connect with you. I can help you take the next right step in your baby feeding journey so that you feel less anxiety and get more joy out of those moments when you are feeding your baby. I can't wait to hear from you. Talk to you soon. When he weaned at that 10-month mark, did you still have a lot of milk at that time? Did you have to manage?
No, I think by 8 months we had already, by 8 months I had started supplementing with like whole milk. And
by 8 months?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so by 10 months he was really like on pretty much normal food. That didn't happen with my other two. It just happened with him. And if you see him now, it would make sense. He's massive.
Yeah.
He was just a big kid.
Okay. So you're on bed rest for 11 days in the hospital. And then what happened from there?
So then it was like 34 weeks, 6 days or something. So just under the 35 week. After that point, they, again, because my water had broke. And so if I moved, like there was amniotic fluid, but it was like the way that they described it was almost so like a balloon pop. But then if the baby's head moved, it would like stop it. But then if they moved a different way, like there would be a little bit.
Right.
And so there's a risk after so long of, of there being infections or other things like that. So we got to that point where it was like, okay, we think that the baby's going to be fine. So then they gave me medicine to start contractions again, which is, I think, called Pitocin, right? Yeah. So, and that was wild because it was like I wasn't having any contractions. I was on bed rest. It was not comfortable. I had like compression things on my legs that would automatically inflate to like, try to move the fluid. I would get up sometimes and do yoga and they'd come in and be like, you can't get up. You need to lay down.
Oh my God.
And so it was really hard for me to just be and not do anything, even though I also knew like I needed to soak up as much rest as possible before I had this preemie. But it was very, very hard mentally to do.
Yeah.
And then when they gave me the Pitocin, we woke up in the morning. My husband drove my son from Springfield to go, be with his mom or my mom. I don't even remember. And then drove back. And on his drive back, I'm like, you need to like, because I'm not sure you're going to make it in time. And I was sort of freaking out thinking like, oh my God, he's not even going to make it because the contractions just started so quickly and progressed so fast. He did make it in time, but what, and the whole time I'm in Bay State because they have, care. But they didn't have anything set up in the actual room where I was going to have the baby. So they didn't have like the incubator or whatever things that they were going to. And I finally started feeling, and that was another thing. Like I also felt like I didn't have a build up for contractions to kind of like work myself through it. So they hit so hard and I was like, yeah, I need an epidural. There's no way I can handle this. So I got the epidural, which worked exactly as it should.
Good.
And was a completely different experience from the first time. So it was like, oh, it doesn't really hurt. There's pressure, but I could, it was totally different. But the nurses came to check and they were like, oh, okay, there's hair. Close your legs. Wait a minute. We need to get the doctor. And I just started laughing and like my baby was coming. And luckily the doctor came in, nothing was set up, but it was like 2 pushes and there they were, small, but bright pink and screaming. So it was good.
Yeah. So because they needed to be in the NICU, were you able to have those skin to skin moments and breastfeed and all of that initially?
I was lucky. They so had her and placed her on my chest, and the same thing, we did a prolonged cord cutting. Wanted to not have that cut right away, and made sure that like I was very clear with that with all the providers. Oh, another thing that was interesting, because Bay State is a learning hospital. I don't know if, I mean, I'm sure Greenfield is, but at Bay State, I had a nurse at one point, probably when they gave me the Pitocin, came and asked, is it okay if like a student comes and observes the birth? And I said no. Mm-hmm. Because I was also, still expecting, okay, I'm going to have this preemie, and they are still going to be small, and they may not be breathing well. And we didn't know what was going to happen. And I didn't want any other like pressure from other people to try to contain myself. I wanted, it was already a stressful situation. And so I said no, and they were respectful of that. And I'm like glad that I said what I needed. Mm-hmm. But so I was able to, like hold her right away. She hatched like a pro. And then they did take her to do all the vitals and the APGAR score. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And then they took her up to the NICU unit. And that was the scary part. So they take her to the NICU unit and say that, we're going to let you know, like when everything's settled, when you can come up. So then hours went by, and to the point where, okay, now I'm concerned. Like, where is my baby? Why am I not able to be with them now? Like, I need to be with them. I was getting bullshit. Mm-hmm. Hormones are crazy. And I was like, really, my head was ready to spin. And so like we call up to the front desk to ask, and the nurses said, oh, okay, somebody, a doctor's going to come down and talk to you. Oh. And I like lost it. And the doctor comes in the room. My husband remembers, he's like, I thought you were going to like rip this person's face off. My eyes were crazy. So the doctor comes in, and I was just waiting for him to say something was wrong and for me to lose it, because I should have been with the baby. And they were like, their breathing had dropped, some heart rate had changed. So they ended up moving the baby into a different unit they had sort of like an A and B, and one was more severe than the other. And so they got moved to the kind of more critical. But they were okay, and I could go upstairs now, but I was very angry that
nobody had told you that all this was happening.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. But then we were allowed up, and that was also heartbreaking and humbling to go into a NICU unit and to see other babies who were really, really struggling, and felt really blessed that, mine in comparison was not. So they spent like that first night in the more critical unit, then the second night in the other unit. On the third night, they were every single score was like perfect, and they passed the car seat test, and we got to go home.
Oh, wow. So then you're able to head home and be reunited with the toddler, Sawyer. And how did it go? Breastfeeding, now you're managing, being a mom of two, you're breastfeeding a preemie. Were there any hiccups there as you settle into home life?
Yeah, so there were some concerns with her being a preemie of not necessarily being able to be flat at first. And there was more feeding, like shorter increments, not as long. I remember, Ollie was tiny enough that I could really kind of pick them up like one hand, almost like a soda can, and still be able to pick up, because I had stairs. So if we were sleeping upstairs, then we had to get downstairs, so I could pick up Sawyer in one arm and then pick her up with one hand.
Oh, wow.
And then I could carry them both down the stairs, because those stairs at my house were a little scary. But my kids ended up learning to do stairs very, very young because of it.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, and Sawyer, I spent a lot of time just at the beginning, like we would hang out in the house and be in one room so he could, block off the stairs so he couldn't get hurt. And we were confined to an area and he could do his thing and just be with baby and be with both of them.
Yeah. Okay. And did he have any curiosity about breastfeeding that you remember, or?
No, I mean, I think he still remembered it for himself, maybe. I don't know.
And you described the intensity of your feeling of motherhood with the first. Did that continue throughout the second?
Yeah. So with my second, it brought up a whole bunch of emotions because of having a daughter, and I had been abused as a child, so all of these things came forward during that time for me, and so like I kind of really went into a depression and like shut down in a lot of ways. So there was so much intensity from the first, it was like you walk the threshold into motherhood now, like you're forever changed. But the second was a totally different experience. I really did have postpartum depression after, and it wasn't anything to do with like the baby. I could have just been with my babies all day, every day. It was everything else and anyone else I didn't have any extra for.
Yeah. Almost like a postpartum OCD or something, like a hyper vigilance.
Yeah. Oh, it was crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was abnormal. I was super scared even to like have them in a room, like afraid like someone's going to come and steal my kid at night. Like I totally went a little bit crazy.
Yeah. Did you recognize at the time that it was probably on the scale of like postpartum depression or OCD or something? And did you seek out help for that? Or did you, what was it not until later that you were able to see that it was beyond the scale of normal?
I think that I knew, and probably everyone around me knew that it wasn't normal. And I did have support. But also I think that a lot of people just kind of let me, I didn't like go necessarily seeking support or counseling, but I was very aware of why I was feeling the way I was, and like and understanding like myself, to have compassion for myself, like that makes sense. Like yeah. and so most of the people in my life kind of understood that as well, but it was very obvious.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's really, really good that the people in your life were able to recognize A, what was happening, and B, that it made sense.
Yeah.
Given your background. Yeah. I mean, we're all just doing the best we can in the moment to get day by day. And you felt fine in your mothering, but I think you mentioned at the beginning that it was impacting maybe other relationships.
Yeah.
But those people, it sounds like they were understanding.
Right. I mean, understanding to a point for sure. You know, it definitely impacted my marriage, you know, because I was so hands-on detached parenting that I had very little time for a marriage or intimacy or anything else. I didn't, and the co-sleeping, you know, because I had all of what had happened to me kind of came up and like I was triggered, I guess. I, you know, got to a point where I just was I was uncomfortable with my husband to an extent, even around my daughter, which I knew like made no actual sense, but I couldn't get past it.
Yeah.
And, so, you know, there was a point in time where like he was sleeping in another room and I was sleeping in a room with both babies. And cause I just couldn't, I just didn't feel
right.
Like safe. I don't know.
Yeah. Wow.
But I mean, I also knew, and they knew like it wasn't normal, but it wasn't. And again, I probably should have sought help or medication sooner, but it was like a survival mode. And that's what worked until it didn't work. And I really needed help. And then,
right.
Yeah. and finally really talked to somebody, and they were like, yeah, that's not normal.
Right. Yeah.
We can help you.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So how long did you end up breastfeeding your second?
So that was a big thing. So when Ollie came, because of being a preemie, I felt like I had literally made, I would have made any deal, pact with any demon or God to like get this baby here healthy. I'll do whatever you need. And so I had also made this pact with them that I'll breastfeed you as long as you need. And so we breastfed for 2 years, for a full 2 years, and they were definitely biting and could ask and would have probably continued to breastfeed. And breastfeeding when we stopped was like a super challenge. They were not happy about it at all. But by then it was like, okay, I really wanted my body back. And they were very capable to be well nourished without me. And so we stopped. But for 2 years.
Yeah. And so what did weaning look like then? If they weren't ready, what did you have to do to?
Because at that point we were still really only doing it at night, and I was working, waitressing and bartending. So often I would work evenings and come home late, but then I might be home at like 2:00 in the morning if I closed the bar, and then they would wake up because they wanted to have that cuddle time and nursing time. And it wasn't at all because they were hungry in the middle of the night. It was just that time.
The reconnection.
But so it took a lot of like, just kind of cuddling in bed and being, no, we're not going to do that. And then, crying and having kind of a big fit about it because they wanted to. But after a couple of nights, it was fine.
Yeah.
And it sort of was like, okay, they knew at least if I came home from work, I was still going to come in and like lay with them and take a minute with them or whatever. And then they wouldn't even, after that, a few nights, and they wouldn't even necessarily wake up when I go home.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so then, how old was your second when your third was born?
9.
Oh yeah, that's right. There's a big gap. Yeah.
Big difference. Yeah. And then, and Ollie was 7. And so, yeah, I had some miscarriages in between there. And I had also had one pregnancy that I had terminated because I had gone back to school and was in this program to become a physical therapist assistant. And it was a 2-year program, and it was like we weren't in that place. It was a hard choice, but we weren't in the place to have a baby then, and so we chose, to not. And then I finished school, graduated, got a job. Doing something I absolutely, absolutely loved, which was at the time I was working at CAPS. And so I was working with kids who had disabilities, and I'd work with them in schools, and I did physical therapy with them while they were at school. Loved it, loved it, loved it. I love kids. And got pregnant again. But I had always wanted 3. And so we were like, okay, we're going to do this. And so, yeah, let's do it one more time. But I also was very aware that, my pregnancy might be hard. And the third pregnancy was also kind of a challenge. I had health issues that happened again, which made me not, have to stop working around 7 months.
Yeah.
And I also knew that for me, having a baby meant breastfeeding, and then I was going to be home. They're not going to daycare. They're not going to anybody else. The whole point for me was to do it all. I wanted that experience. And so that was like hard financially.
Yeah.
But that was a big choice that we made, being like really aware that if I was going to do this, that meant like I'm home. So we're going to have to figure out how to function, money and all the things so that I could be home and be the same kind of mom I was to the other 2, which I did. I was glad that I got to do it. And the big kids helped a lot. I think it made them, when we first told them, I think Ollie was excited. My oldest was not excited. And he's like, you already have 2.
Why do you need a third?
He's like, this is not a good idea.
I know. If I were ever to have a third, that is exactly the dynamic that would play out.
And so that was, I think ultimately, like, it's made my big kids way more like kind, compassionate people and more responsible. They had to do things at times to help. And then they also saw, I had morning sickness. And before I ever told them, I would drive them to school, and I had morning sickness like clockwork almost. I would drive past a certain point on the way and would multiple times would have to like stop on the way to work to throw up at this one spot every time. And so I was like, Mama, and I was at kindergarten or first grade. But they'd be like, what's wrong? Why are you sick? And then eventually, of course, saying like I was pregnant. But so it made them, and then seeing me as it progressed, I have a heart condition, which I actually had an ablation for after I had Ollie. After I had my second one, I had an ablation, which mostly fixed the problem. I have an extra AV node, so I used to take beta blockers all the time. And so the ablation, they like zap that little electrical impulse in your heart that's telling it to beat more than it should, and it solved the problem until I got pregnant a third time. And then you just have you're producing, like, your body is doing this more blood and more work, and then it triggered the a tachycardia again. And I also, so I ended up being, with all my pregnancies, I ended up having to have medication, which was a huge difference from when I was first pregnant with Sawyer. The medication was graded, whatever class it was, is like, definitely not necessarily being safe, because it was really kind of unknown, some of the effects, versus by the time I had my youngest, like, I had already had experience with it 2 times, and then the medical information was different. So the first time it was like super scary, and by the third time it was like, no, the baby's going to be fine,
and I'm going to do this for my own health.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that does make a big difference.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so you were able to keep baby cooking, and then how did early breastfeeding go? And then
and by the third one, breastfeeding I definitely like knew, and definitely with the third one, I felt like the baby came out and wasn't a stranger. I knew this baby looked just like my other babies, smelled like my other babies. Like, this was my baby.
And even with such a, like a 7-year gap between the last time, it didn't feel like you were relearning a skill. It felt familiar still.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think so. Although, I did experience pain, with the first breastfeeding. There was times where I had like sores, and I had one inverted nipple, before. And so that one side like was a struggle. By the second pregnancy, that problem had like resolved itself. And so by the third, that wasn't there anymore, but it definitely went through the normal like soreness and, which positions worked for him and I. And,
but you have more tools in your tool belt by the time you have your third. So you know how to play around a little bit more.
Totally.
Yeah. So what would you consider your biggest challenge when it came to breastfeeding?
A challenge, I guess, like publicly, I was comfortable and thought it was like the most beautiful, natural, empowering thing, but definitely experienced a few times out. I remember once at Chili's, getting some real looks when I tried to breastfeed. And one time, which was with my first, when I had gone and visited with some girlfriends and taken this new baby.
Oh yeah.
And then ended up breastfeeding. We were all like chit-chatting together, and I just breastfeed, but I could tell it made other people in the room like very uncomfortable. And I was not covering up. I was full boob, like out over the shirt. I didn't lift the shirt up. I wanted skin to skin. I had big breasts that was going to like engulf, I felt like, and suffocate my kid if I didn't see what was happening. That obviously wasn't going to happen, but that's how I felt at the time. And I was still, when that story happened, it was still probably only a couple months in, like maybe, 8 weeks, 11 weeks.
Yeah. There's still a learning curve.
Yeah. And definitely, like, I felt like they were uncomfortable, and so then that made me uncomfortable. And then I remember I went into another room, but I otherwise was like very, very open about breastfeeding anywhere. I had no problem with, and I had such like this crazy, like I had said before, how like I was so focused. So I think I very much like expressed that kind of energy. So for the most part, no one was going to come up and say anything to me because they probably were aware that like I would bite their head off.
Right. Yeah.
If they had anything to say.
Right.
But so I didn't really like experience anybody saying anything to me. I definitely had a few times where I felt like I could tell people may have been uncomfortable. And so maybe I would go in another room. But for the most part, like I was going to do what was comfortable for me. And that definitely never meant covering my baby.
Right.
Like with even like a blanket or something over, like none of them liked it. They would pull it off.
Right.
And then they wouldn't latch right. And they'd be like, what is happening? Because like that's not what we would normally do.
Right. Exactly.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people just don't understand how challenging it would be to cover a baby.
Yeah.
While feeding. It's just not possible for so many babies.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I know we talked about your yoga studio at the beginning. I do want to give you another opportunity to just talk about the ways that you serve our community, because I have found getting to know you to be so lovely. I wish I got to spend more time at your studio, but the first time I went to your studio was you were doing along with somebody else, you were hosting a women's wellness event.
Megan Brocklebank. She's lovely, amazing.
An herbalist. Yeah. And so, and I know you do aerial yoga at your studio. You do some gentle yoga. You do a mom and baby yoga event. So what are some of your favorite offerings that you have at the studio? I know I just listed a few. But.
Yeah, no. I've been teaching yoga for 20 years and have a lot of like exercise science background. And so I taught at our local Athol YMCA for about 16 years. I taught a whole bunch of different programs there for fitness, including Silver Sneakers, and ran a lot of the programs for seniors. I love seniors and I love kids. And I'm now at a point where every single class I teach is pretty much my favorite class, because I only teach what I really, really want to do and love.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And
what a life.
Yes. It's been a dream. So I have my own space. I've had it for a little over a year and a half.
And it's beautiful. Your space is so beautiful.
So it was really like a dream. And I try to offer a lot of different classes. So gentle yoga, I offer a community class on Fridays at 9:00. It is open to everyone. It's super, super gentle. We do a lot of stuff in chairs. It was originally a class that was just for seniors, meaning ages 65 and older, but I've opened it up to anybody because I've met people on all different levels of fitness and age. It's a class that I still love to do. Like gentle movement is, I teach also a lot of functional patterns. So functional movement patterns beyond yoga, because we got to be able to get up and get down and do certain movements with our arms and body. So I try to
pick up the groceries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I incorporate a lot of functional patterns into my teaching. And then meditation and mudras. I also end all my classes with a sound bath.
Yeah, that's amazing. And if listeners aren't local, because many of my listeners aren't, but they want to connect with you, where do they do that?
I am on Instagram and Facebook. You can find me on Instagram as Hometown Yogi. And I do have a website, Hometown Yogi B, just the letter B. Hometown Yogi B for my website. So you can find me there.
Great. And we'll have all that in the show notes so people can click very easily.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much. It's amazing to me how when we are in the thick of the postpartum experience, or any experience really, it just becomes our new normal. And we might know that something feels difficult or challenging, yet it's hard for us to seek help for something that we know might be extreme. And in Brandy's situation, it was not the childcare tasks that felt difficult, but the fact that her intensity of wanting to be the only person who cared for her children or who were with her children impacted the rest of her life. And I know that there are other people who can relate to that. So if that is something that you have experienced and you would like to chat about how that has impacted you, then please join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. That is where we have these sorts of discussions, how baby feeding impacts all aspects of our life, including our relationships with other people. And if you would like to make your relationships go a little bit more smoothly by not arguing about what's for dinner, then go to feastandfettle.com where you get $30 off your first week's delivery of delicious home-cooked meals by using my code MILK. You get to choose from a wide menu of options, and you don't have to order every week. You can just order on the busy weeks. I can't wait for you to try it out and report back to me. Enjoy.